So, hello and welcome to our live stream. So, hello and welcome to our live stream. I believe we have actually started. I think this is the 20-something of our series. And we're currently covering NLP and tarot reading together. We've covered some tarot and Kabbalah in the earlier sessions, a couple of beginner sessions which I've signposted in the units tab of the Facebook group where all of these recordings are. So hello to everyone joining us for the live presentation, and hello, this is a wave for those watching us as a recording. Today's Philosopher's Stone cards that I've been reading for myself as part of my contemplation during the lockdown period. Today's cards were a bit harder than some of the others. They were these two, which is basically insight and tension. And I love this particular deck because whilst this card is quite a powerful card in terms of having insight when one is blinded, but I love this particular card. The deck uses very cleverly light and shade. So for example here, the crack that's down the middle of the stone is actually making a shadow, which is a zigzag path of shadow across the mountain surface here. So it's only through the crack that we actually see the path underneath the tension. And I love that as a symbol, as a healing symbol, as a therapeutic symbol, as a mystical symbol. It really does have some resonance. There's a famous, I think it's a Leonard Cohen song where it says something like the crack is where the light shines through. And I've actually done a reading list for this sequence of NLP that I put on my website. That's at marcuskatz.com, and there's a book there called Strong in the Broken Places, which is also, I think that's a very good image of the whole concept of being strong. That path of darkness that is made is the path that actually leads you forwards, because it's the strongest path that you actually have. So what we're going to cover today is a little bit more NLP. I'm also going to read from Invisible Cities, our short bedtime story for this evening. And with the weekend coming up, I thought I would also read a slightly longer story, which will maybe take the whole session as a bedtime story over the weekend. And that will be from Borges's collection called Labyrinths. And that will be from this one. We've already read a short story from here called The God Script, which you can find back in the archives, and I'll be reading a story from here called The Lottery of Babylon, which I think is a very powerful story as well. But for today we just have a city from our Invisible Cities. So I hope you were practicing yesterday with your VACOG, with your visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, gustatory things. Visual, auditory, kinesthetic, watching how people's eyes move when they talk, whether it's remembered, constructed, recalled, constructed, and so on. It's one of the key components of NLP where we learn what's called sensory acuity, which is basically listening to people, but a souped-up version of listening to people. And it just comes with practice. So all of these things will come with practice, and you'll find yourself finding new ways of using them in your tarot card reading. You might even wonder just how much that you've actually learned, because it's entirely possible that you could have learned even more than you think. And it's not that you have to learn or you must learn all of the things that we're going to cover, but it is quite incredible sometimes when you think that you can't and you actually can do a lot more than you think. And yeah, practicing watching the news is good. That's one of the things you can do. And maybe you will find yourself doing more things with this in future. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to add, you'll notice our special offer here. We have now got new and improved with added Milton model and meta model. Milton model and meta model. And I thought I'd introduce a really cool term to you today from NLP that sounds very fancy when you say it, but it's actually something very, very simple. It's something very simple indeed. And you might be able to learn it and apply it, and I'd like if you could apply it. It would be something that I'm not telling you you have to do it or you must do it, certainly not. In fact, you mustn't feel forced into doing it at all. The way I teach is so that it enables people to feel as if they can do things, things that they thought that they couldn't. So what we're going to cover is Milton model and meta model in brief, so I can introduce it, and along with our triangle, along with our linking words, along with our change components, along with VACOG, we're going to build all of these up so you can see how they all apply quite naturally in tarot card reading. If you have any questions, just put them into the comment feed and I'll take a look at them as we go along. I should be able to do that, in fact I probably can, but you don't have to if you don't want to. So one of the things that we're going to cover then is Milton model and meta model. Now, to basically put it in a nutshell, the best description I ever heard of this before we go into the detail of it is that the Milton model allows us to weave a spell and the meta model allows us to unpick a curse. Okay, so Milton model and meta model are language patterns that are exactly the same but seen from different ways. It's a bit like seeing a city. If you approach it one way, you see it one particular way. If you approach it another, you get a totally different impression of the whole city. It depends on how you're approaching it. And the meta model and Milton model are sort of the same city, just approached from different ways. And I hope so you can get some sleep. And yes, all of these will be in the units, and you'll be able to watch them in the recordings, of course. So the Milton model then, both of these models are ways of speaking, ways of listening, more importantly, that allow us to really go down a level underneath the presented language into some of the unconscious processes that are underneath it. And the Milton model allows us to listen to those and then almost cast a spell by using them, and the meta model allows us to undo other people's self-hypnosis, their own curses that they've placed on themselves, by almost hypnotizing themselves into certain ways of thinking, certain ways of believing that are apparent in the language that they use. And by listening to it and then unpicking it, we can then gently question and investigate and unpack that thinking. And we can do this under what I call pub conversation, pub change, just by the by, or we can do it under deep trance, hypnosis, and so forth. It depends on how much we want the conscious mind to actually be involved in it. In a tarot card reading, I quite often like to use these within the stories within my tarot card reading. So I'll actually tell a story to the clients that seems to have something to do with the tarot cards, but it's actually a way that I can make a boundary around some NLP change work within that story. So I deliver a story and then I get back to the tarot card reading itself. So the negative mindsets that Diane's sort of pointing out there are our own form of self-hypnosis through language. We bind our reality through language, our syntax, our grammar, the way we look at the world. I once was learning the basics of Japanese, and one of the beautiful things I liked about Japanese was the word, for example, for vase, like a vase on a shelf, would be different depending on whether it was a gift or whether the person had bought it. And the question asked in the class was, well, how would you know which word to use to refer to the vase if you didn't know if it had been a gift or whether it had been owned by the person, bought by the person? And the answer, of course, was that you wouldn't even mention the vase if you didn't know, because that would bring potential shame on the owner of the vase, because if you said that's a beautiful vase and they said, yes, I chose it, I bought it, that is bringing unwanted attention on your host and their ego and so forth, and their pride that they have chosen a beautiful vase. So that just wouldn't be done in Japanese culture at all. So you wouldn't refer to the vase unless you knew from the host or from someone else whether it had been a gift or chosen by the host themselves. You wouldn't put them in that position. So the word could be very different for either, and it didn't matter because of the cultural construct that was around it. And there's a load of stuff in Japanese, there's a load of stuff in Russian as well about time semantics that refer to a very different way of looking at time. And this is apparent in language, and it's really important that we're aware when we're using it of how language can affect us. So with the Milton model and with the meta model, they are two different ways, like approaching a city in two different ways and seeing it totally different and it taking you a different direction depending on how it's used. But it's the same number of language patterns. So I'm going to look at one of the language patterns, and each of the language patterns sits inside both the Milton model and the meta model, depending on how you use it. And the one that I'm going to demonstrate and ask you to go out and listen for over the next few days, and don't go out, stay indoors, but listen to it on television, in plays, in documentaries, in interviews. Politicians are a good one, celebrities being interviewed are a good one as well, is this. It is called the modal operator of necessity. The modal operator of necessity. And I just love the phrase because it sounds very, very fancy schmancy. When you say, I'm just observing and listening for the modal operator of necessity in your sentence structure. But actually what it means is it's an operator that changes the mode of the necessity that you're expressing in a sentence. And some examples might be could and must. Okay, so those words could and must are very different to each other, but they both express a sort of necessity. I could do something, but I must do something. Okay, those are very different sort of operators on the necessity of what you're talking about. I must lose weight. I could go on holiday. Okay, now a lot of other words form modal operators of necessity, and if you rewatch this recording you will find that I used about 10 of them as I was introducing this section. So I used a lot of must, could, should, might, not, couldn't, wouldn't, mustn't, and so forth in the first sort of 10 minutes of this section. So if you now go back and listen, you'll see how I introduced those modal operators as a demonstration before we actually got to explain them. And basically there are things like this. I've written them down, some of them. So could, would, should, can, can't, won't, will not, must, may. Okay? So these in linguistics, which is half of the structure of NLP, are called modal operators of necessity. Okay? And they basically demonstrate how someone is operating in terms of the mode of their necessity to do something, their drive to do it, or how they represent it inside their head. Now, when we look at the Milton model approach to this, this is to weave a spell with it. When we look at the meta model part of it, is to unpick it in someone else. And the standard way of unpicking it tends to be to ask questions. Now, this is where a lot of NLP training, in my view, goes horribly wrong, because it turns people into almost nasty interrogators as to someone else's state, and this is not what we want with our form of NLP. We want to be more elegant about it. And so we can ask questions about it, but first of all, just listen. So when you're listening to someone, listen out for those words must, should, could, can't, won't. And some people use certain sets of them more than others. Some people use them in different states. Some people use them as sort of their tonality shifts when they say it, because they're operating from a younger part of themselves when they say it, or even a super ego part of themselves where their parents used to tell them that they mustn't speak out of turn, for example. And all of these should, must, can, all of these modal operators are around us all of the time. So when you're listening for them, you're approaching it from the meta model. You're approaching the city from one direction, and when you're weaving a spell and using them to make an influential change with someone, or with hypnosis, then you're using the Milton model. Make sense? So if I gave an example of it being used in the Milton model first, then I might say to you, it's welcome to our session. We might learn a lot more about this card than you think today. We might learn a lot more about this card, because you can see all sorts of things in this card. And it's very important that you mustn't think that you've seen everything yet. You mustn't think that you've seen everything yet in this card, because you can always see more than you think. And isn't it wonderful to know that you can see more than you think, and that there is more outside that you mightn't have seen already? And to have that freedom in order to understand that it doesn't matter if you feel that you should have seen a lot more in our session today, because it's more important that you can now see. And obviously I'm laying these examples on very heavily, but just to demonstrate the point of using modal operators. In hypnotherapy, we might use them in the sense of, for example, if we use truism suggestion again, I might say, as you sit in your chair and you can hear the birds singing outside, because you can also notice your breathing. And you might begin to wonder whether you're going to close your eyes, or you might not close your eyes yet, because it's only important to know that if you feel that you must do something, to know that it's you that's going to do it when you can. And you can, be able to do that. Okay, so we're going to use the modal operators in order to weave the spell. And with all of our examples of meta model, Milton model language patterns, you can always flip them around. Now, when we use the meta model, oh yeah, work contracts, contractual things, car salesmen. I've got a lot of stories about bad NLP and car salesmen. Yes, to listen out for these things is really important, and always to take a breath and a space and not be forced into something, because you can always question the language. Now, in terms of the meta model, unpicking a curse, I wanted to tell you a quick story. Quite often I've done change work with people in a car for some reason. I've been having a conversation, I've been driving them somewhere or driving with them. We've had a conversation, and for some reason I always seem to operate best in a car, talking to someone in passing and doing some change work with them. And perhaps I should do a sort of carpool karaoke version of NLP. But I was driving somebody, a photojournalist, back to the train station once, and she was telling me about her work, which I knew about. She was very much a sort of social justice champion, and she took photographs of deprived areas, people in minority situations, all sorts of things to raise their profile and to side with a sort of humanitarian approach. And she was very keen to do this. It was what she felt she'd been born to do. She was very good at it. She'd won at least one very, very high award for her photojournalism. And we were chatting about that, and then she just mentioned in passing that when she wasn't quite looking forward to getting back to her actual home because she travelled a lot, because her work office was absolutely a mess, and she said, I keep meaning to tidy it, and every time I try, and I know I should, but it's just one of those things that I just cannot do. And I heard just cannot do, so again, that's our way in word, just cannot do. And I'd also heard her say, I know I should do it. I know I should do it. Now the thing is we were driving along, and it struck me that she obviously did want to be in a position where she could do something about it. So I said to her, might I make a suggestion? And she said, yeah, that's fine. I said, well, I know it sounds strange, but what I would suggest to you, and you might want to do this, is when you get back, the first thing I want you to do, if you want to follow my suggestion, is stand at the office door and say out loud, and you must say it out loud, you must say it out loud. So I gave her a must that was a very easy thing to do. You must say it out loud just once, no matter how silly it sounds, and therefore I downplayed the change work by saying no matter how silly it sounds. I didn't have to say that, but it's sometimes useful to say that. I could clean and organise my office. Say it out loud, I could clean my office. And then if you want, I said to her, if you want, then just turn away and go and do something else. It's absolutely fine, but I just want you to say that just once. And that's the thing you must say, okay? So I gave her a must and a could. And a couple of weeks later, she emailed me with talking by email, and she said, oh my God, I don't believe it. It's really weird. And I always tell my students, you get a tick mark above your shoulder every time a client says to you, it was really weird, but this happened, or I did this. Because they always start with, it's really weird, when an unconscious change is actually operating to make a change. Because they can't really explain it consciously, then they often start, it's really odd, it's really weird. I don't know if this has got anything to do with our work, but and then they'll tell you the change thing, and you get an invisible tick mark. It's the only recognition you'll get for your change work every time that someone says that. Anyhow, she said, it's really weird. I went and did the thing you said that I had to do, and I stood there and I said I could change the office, and I started to turn around, and then a couple of days later I'd entirely blitzed the office, reorganized it, sorted it all out. It's absolutely great now. So I don't know what you did, what you said, but thank you. And what it was she was holding a must, a should, modal operator of necessity inside of her head. She was telling herself, probably quite rightly as far as she was concerned, I should do it. But that gun she was holding to her head, notice I did this before I said gun, the gun that she was holding to her head was exactly the gun that she was fighting against in every other aspect of her life. She was a social justice warrior and I guess a sort of liberal in terms of fighting against tyranny and oppression and injustice and so on. But of course, she was giving herself an inner tyranny. She had made a voice that was saying, you should do this. So of course, she was rebelling against the should. So by actually saying to herself, overriding the should with a could, it gave her permission. It gave her permission. And in NLP, sometimes there's a sentence about you have to find the thing that makes the most change. The sort of pivot, the key, the smallest thing that will make the most change. And for her, it was simply changing that word from I should do it to I could do it. And the moment she gave herself permission to do it, then it released the block on fighting off the inner tyranny that she had put herself into, because she had woven that spell as a curse inside her head. So the meta model is to listen for it and unpick it, change it around, and the Milton model is to utilize it to generate some change. So does that make sense in terms of a broad description of something called the meta model and the Milton model, and then language patterns underneath them, one of which we've now looked at called modal operator of necessity, which is must, could, might, shouldn't, won't. And I would ask you to go and listen to those things just to begin with. Listen to when people say, oh, I really shouldn't, and then they do. Why are they telling themselves that they shouldn't do something and then doing it? And quite often there's a reason. They are getting something out of that. Supposing they say to themselves, I can do this. And you say to them, well, you can do it because you are doing it. And see what happens to that slight change. Okay, you might spoil the fun in it for them and they might actually stop doing it, or certainly they'll stop saying that they shouldn't do it before they actually do it. Okay, but Diane's saying, I wonder which family member helped her create that head situation. Longer story, obviously for every client, but or friend in this case, but sometimes is not really important from a brief therapy point of view to approach the deeper constructs unless they're actually impacting across a whole range of things, which of course they do. But from a lot of NLP change work, we just want to change one behavior, one change, one thing at a time, or go deeper and then let the whole change filter up into lots of other activities. And yeah, sometimes it's really useful to go into the past, and sometimes it isn't. Okay, so that's could, would, might, won't, and have to. That's a modal operator of necessity, a language pattern within Milton model and meta model. I'm looking over there because I'd written Milton model and meta model in order to remind myself what we were going to talk about today. So over the next few days, we're going to look at other aspects of Milton and meta model. Now, Ileana's saying that she's been listening to herself, which is brilliant. We start by listening to ourselves, I hope. I need to and I have to. One of the more subtle aspects of questions that you can follow with the meta model is to say to yourself or to someone else, what would happen if you didn't? So what might happen if you didn't have to do that? What would happen if you had a choice? When you tell yourself, I need to, what would happen if you didn't need to anymore? Or you can ask yourself, what needs to happen for me to not need to tell myself that anymore? Okay, so you can start to unpick some of these language patterns inside your own head, or get someone else to do it with you. And quite often you can do that under hypnosis, because you can bypass the critical faculty, and with hypnotherapy you can actually sort of weave a sort of confusional message to the person. So just very quickly before we go on to our reading of the day, a bedtime story, because I just wanted to introduce this one thing because it's a big thing, massive thing, Milton model, meta model, and then the patterns underneath it. Here is how I might use a confusional method with a client using the Milton model. Okay, so I do an induction, for example, using truism, suggestion, and as they close their eyes and relaxed, I might start to say things like, and sometimes we tell ourselves, I need to do something, and sometimes you'll notice the linker word, and sometimes we tell ourselves, I have to do something, and because this places a lot of internal stress when sometimes we might not need to do so, although it is possible sometimes to want to be able to do something more quickly than you did before without the internal stress that is needed, you think, sometimes in order to be able, and you'll notice I'm linking words together, so this doesn't make grammatical sense, but we're getting into a more hypnotic way of speaking. And a confusional method will switch these things around, so we would continue, and it's possible when we need to know how to do something best, we have found that we need to tell ourselves things. However, it's also the case that sometimes needing to tell ourselves things is not the thing we need to do anymore once we have already realized how quickly we can do those things, and then afterwards wonder if we needed to tell ourselves how much we needed to do those things. Because need will tell us how to know that we need to do something, but it is only a brief moment before it gets in the way of us having to do the thing that we thought we needed to tell ourselves how to do. And it's entirely possible when we get tired of our voice inside that allows us to be able to wonder, what would it be like to need to know how we could do something more quickly than we ever needed to before, without needing to know how that change had happened, so that we could allow ourselves, and we can, allow ourselves to be able to know how necessary things are. And we don't need to know anymore that it's a modal operator of necessity, because we're always too busy doing the things that we just somehow knew afterwards that those were the things that were easy to need not to know how to need to do. And isn't it remarkable that we can begin to relax ourselves into those things? And we would continue on in that language pattern, weaving metaphors, doing all of the other sort of things that we can do with NLP and hypnotherapy, and weaving a confusional pattern, messing around with the modal operators, binding them, unbinding them, giving them options, collapsing them, overwhelming them, and so forth, by casting a spell using modal operators of necessity. Particularly if the person said, I really need to change. I really need to change. And it's sometimes what we need to do is listen to ourselves, repeat it back to ourselves in order to realize how little need there was to be able to say those things to ourselves. Okay, so we are going to have our bedtime story now. I might read this. In fact, I could read it, and in fact, I can read it, so I will. And if you watch this video back, I'd recommend watching the first 10 minutes all over again to see how it can work in order to put. Oh, am I frozen or am I back again? Am I frozen for everyone or just for Debbie Freeman? Testing 1 2 3. Good, I'm back. Right, okay. So this is from Citizen Desire, the section of Citizen Desire in Calvino's Invisible Cities that we're reading from. Despina can be reached in two ways, by ship or by camel. The city displays one face to the traveller arriving overland, and a different one to him who arrives by sea. It's almost as if this was planned. When the camel driver sees at the horizon of the tableland the pinnacle of the skyscrapers come into view, the radar antennae, the white and red windsocks flapping, the chimneys belching smoke, he thinks of a ship. He knows it is a city, but he thinks of it as a vessel that will take him away from the desert, a windjammer about to cast off, with the breeze already swelling the sails, not yet unfurled, or a steamboat with its boiler vibrating in the iron keel. And he thinks of all of the ports, the foreign merchandise, the cranes unload onto the docks, the taverns where crews of different flags break bottles over one another's heads, the lighted ground floor windows, each with a woman combing her hair. In the coastline's haze, though, the sailor discerns the form of a camel's withers, an embroidered saddle with glittering fringe between two spotted humps, advancing and swaying. He knows it is a city too, but he thinks of it as a camel, from whose pack hang wineskins and bags of candied fruit, date wine, tobacco leaves, and already he sees himself at the head of a long caravan, taking him away from the desert of the sea, towards oases of fresh water in the palm trees' jagged shade, towards palaces of thick, whitewashed walls, tiled courts where girls are dancing barefoot, moving their arms, half hidden by their veils and half revealed. Each city receives its form from the desert it opposes. And so the camel driver and the sailor see Despina, a border city between two deserts. The city of Despina in Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. Okay, so over the next few days we're going to cover some more NLP, and more specifically I'm going to demonstrate some actual tarot card readings using some of the NLP techniques that we're looking at, some of the language patterns. But for now, I just want you to listen, watch interviews, watch politicians, salespeople, and listen for the language patterns that we're covering. It's the best way to learn NLP is just by listening. Okay, so where are we? Yeah, well, we're dead on, 40 minutes dead on. That's brilliant. So thank you for your time and attention. If you have any particular questions about NLP, hypnotherapy, Kabbalah, tarot divination, and the Western esoteric industry system, please be my guest and ask away. At the moment, at the time of this recording, on the day that our Prime Minister in England came out of intensive care and hopefully back into a hospital bed, and we are still under lockdown, and that situation won't be reviewed for at least another few days, and then likely to be extended at least a week or maybe even two. So we have plenty of time, and we can use it wisely, I'm sure, and I would like us to do so. Okay, bye for now everyone. Take care.